Welcome again. What a great week we are having. But all around the week, of course, we're thinking about John Hewitt, who started us all off on this venture. And so now we're taking the time today to focus specifically of him, give the man his place. John Hewitt is remembered as the father figure and prophetic precursor of the current generation of Ulster poets. In 2002, to mark the 25th anniversary of John Hewitt's death, the Society hosted an event entitled John Hewitt Remembered, when we invited some of those who knew John to share their memories of him. Now, 30 years after the death of the poet, writer and art critic, we've invited some people to reflect on the man they knew and on Hewitt's legacy on culture, arts and heritage in Ireland. And in marking the 30th anniversary of John's death, I'm conscious that we are also marking this week the 30th anniversary of the John Hewitt International Summer School. On the panel this afternoon, we have Dr. Brian Kennedy, over here, former head of fine and applied arts at the Ulster Museum. Brian is an art historian and biographer of the artist T.P. Flanagan, who was very closely influenced by John Hewitt and was also a good friend and former neighbour of him in Mount Charles. And he was a patron of this society for many years. Frank Ormsby, over at the end, one of Northern Ireland's best known and most highly regarded poets, whose collections include his Goat's Milk, New and Selected Poems, Fireflies, The Ghost Train, A Northern Spring, and A Store of Candles, and I see lots of books for sale outside. As an editor, Frank has introduced readers to a wide range of Northern Irish poetry and prose. He edited the collected poems of John Hewitt in 1991, and with Michael Longley, the selected poems of John Hewitt. And Frank tells me he's been very prolific at the moment, and has a new book coming out in September called The Darkness of Snow, which we will all really look forward to reading. Vincent Higgins, here, originally from Ballymena, is one of Northern Ireland's best known actors on stage and screen. And he's currently touring with the Caboche production, which many of us saw and enjoyed. Well, I'm not quite sure that's the word, but certainly it had a great impact on us here in the marketplace last night. As a young actor, Vincent appeared in the very first John Hewitt Summer School, which took place up in Garran Tower in County Antrim in August 1987. The first summer school was organised by Jack McCann, a friend of John Hewitt's for many years. And Vincent and Jack's daughter Peggy Ann McCann gave a rehearsal, it wasn't a rehearsal reading, you're telling me,
Performance.
He gave a performance, thank you, of the Brian Friel play Lovers Winners. And Vincent tells me that his family and the McCanns were all very close. I'm delighted to say, though not able to be here today, that members of the McCann family should be here before the end of the week. Adrian Moynes, a native of Armagh, is a former head of radio and group secretary at RTE. He joined RTE in 1979, and during his time there, he has worked as a producer on both radio and TV, as the editor of young people's programmes and as head of scheduling in TV. It was as a radio producer that Adrian met John Hewitt when he produced the series Maps of Ulster for RTE, in which John was interviewed by David Hammond, another former patron of this summer school. And I'd like to begin this afternoon's proceedings by inviting Adrian to tell us about his encounters with John and to introduce a reading of that script by actors Vincent Higgins, who's also on our panel, and John Paul Connolly, who we saw on stage on Monday night, in Dreams Begin Responsibilities. So would you all please welcome our panel today.
Thank you, Myrtle, and thanks everyone for the welcome. It's nice to be home. We're going back to 1984. We're going back to the 10th of April in that year. And I suppose 1984 was about 15 years into the Troubles. And we weren't to know it then, but I suppose it was about the halfway point of those 3 awful decades. And I had been working in Dublin for 5 years, and with a colleague called Tim Lahan, a Munsterman, we were doing a weekly series called Monday at 9, which was a sort of adult education hour. If you know the radio programme Sunday Miscellany, this was kind of like Sunday Miscellany for self-improvers. It was, you know, there would be a section on science or economics or politics or history or literature. But Tim and I were not journalists, and we were very conscious at the time that the whole sense of Ulster that was being disseminated in the wider world and in the Republic of Ireland was narrowing. All you heard about was this vicious strife between two tribes. And of course the violence was horrible and intensifying, and the attrition was appalling. But there was so much of the reality of life in this part of the world which was being occluded, and the whole discourse was suffering from a narrowing and intensive attrition. So we decided to try to have a little series under the working title of Alternative Ulster, which would amplify, enrich, open a window on the cultural diversity of this part of the world. The contributors were given a brief in which we said, we're asking you to write between 800 and 1,000 words reflecting on your childhood, the communities in which you grew up, the cultural influences you absorbed. Ideally, the scripted material would fall in each case into, say, 3 or 4 sections. A particular section could be devoted to a person, a place, an event, a book, an idea, and so on, which has influenced you. And these pieces would form the basis, the structure for a recorded conversation, approximately 10 minutes long, with David Hammond. And so John Hewitt was one of the people who accepted that invitation, and he prepared, I think, a very memorable vignette which we're about to hear. The other day, looking through the selected poems which Frank has edited with Michael Longley so handsomely, and which are published by Blackstaff Press, I see that the final poem is entitled Postscript 1984. And writing in that year, John Hewitt spoke of our unforgiving hearts by myth and old antipathies betrayed, flared into sudden acts of violence in daily shocking bulletins relayed, and through our dark, dream-clotted consciousness, hosted like banners in some black parade. And that was very much that sense of Ulster and that daily discourse of news headlines, shocking news headlines, which provides a context for these broadcasts. And we resolved finally on the to call the series Maps of Ulster. And I was struck by the coincidence of this resonance in the final verse of John's poem and the title of the series, where he says, now with compulsive resonance they toll Banbridge, Ballykelly, Darkley, Crossmidlane, summoning pity, anger and despair, by grief of kin, by hate of murderous men, till the whole tarnished map is stained and torn, not to be read as pastoral again. Well, Vincent and John Paul, perhaps you'd read the script now. Thank you.
John Hewitt, poet, was born in Belfast in 1907. His working career there was in the role of Keeper of Art in the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery. In In the 1950s, he moved to Coventry in England, curator of a gallery there. When he returned to Belfast, at his retirement early in the 70s, he had a new lease of life as a poet, and his many volumes of poetry since that time have all been published by a local house, Blackstaff Press. He remains our senior poet, very much in touch with the younger writers. Tonight he looks back on some aspects of an Ulster inheritance that have affected his life in some very profound ways.
There's one incident in my family's history that I heard about a very long time ago, which has assumed more and more significance for me as I've grown older. For it helps to explain my natural tendency to hold to a minority view, at odds with my neighbours and fellow countrymen. I first heard about it from my grandmother, my mother's mother. She was born in 1842. Her name before her marriage was Ellen Harrison, daughter of a small farmer near Both Hill, a mill village outside Belfast. It concerned her father, my great-grandfather. But being a child, I hadn't the wit to ask what his Christian name was, so I never knew. And now it's unlikely I'll ever find out. In the Protestant parts of Ulster, there has been a long tradition of religious revivals, of people being converted in large numbers. With varying degree of intensity, these have occurred since the plantation, and I've been aware of several in my own lifetime. But the most remarkable and celebrated took place in 1859. Its impact, the hosts of people involved, and the wide area it covered were so great that it became known as the Year of Grace. Many books were written about it. Even in the past year or two, several studies of the history of local ideas had made reference to it. Sometime in the spring that year, 1859, a revival erupted in the countryside in mid-Antrim, and by the summer spread through the whole northeast, rippling as far as Donegal, Monaghan and Cavan. The form it took was highly emotional, frequently hysterical. Under the influence of itinerant lay preachers, the crowds which gathered to listen were suddenly struck with a tremendous sense of the individual sinfulness. They wept, groaned, cried out in agony, fell insensible, and after a while rose entranced, singing, praying, speaking in strange tongues, rescued by faith in their Saviour from the devil's clutches and eternity in hell. It was like a fierce epidemic, infecting with an astonishing fervour all who touched it. They met in churches, meeting houses, schools, graveyards, and in the open air. On one occasion, 20,000 gathered in the Botanic Gardens, Belfast, singing, praying, falling prostrate, rising redeemed. In Coleraine one afternoon, the multitude of sin-stricken was so great that they had to be carried off the streets into the new town hall, which had just been built, but not yet officially open. Many public houses had to be closed down for lack of trade. Coarse language and violent behaviour were given up widely. It was chiefly among the nonconformists, the Presbyterian, Methodist and Baptist, with rather less Church of Ireland folk, that it was most effective. But there is some evidence that a few Catholics were also caught up in it. In the general animation, which in towns and villages took hold of shopkeepers, farmers, farm labourers, workers in the factories and mills. Most heavily involved were the young women and girls of the working classes.
I was thinking, John, when you were speaking about that time, about the time in history it happened, 1859, was a time of relative prosperity in Ulster. The shipyard was beginning to boom. Linen was in a good way of going as well. Is there any way you can account for this? Can you account for it by the temperament of the people? Did that make them vulnerable to this kind of gospel that was being preached?
Yes, I think it did. You mentioned when it occurred. That was when the Industrial Revolution took root in Ireland. You see, that's one of the differences. We're the only part of Ireland that had the Industrial Revolution. The rest of Ireland hadn't. So that makes us a different people. And this was one of the effects of that difference. My grandmother, who was then 17 years of age, naturally fell into the pattern of the moment. Soon the other members of her family saw the light and found salvation. All of them, except one. Their father, the farmer. When the gusts of emotion and prayer and rousing hymn singing billowed and swept round him, he surprisingly felt no need to join in, to change his life. For he was a good, honest man, sober in his behaviour and habits. This posed a serious challenge to his children. They loved him and longed for their father to share the joy of their redemption. They prayed for him, entreated him, brought in fervent neighbours and powerful preachers to appeal to him, to coax him, to threaten him with the consequences of his obstinacy. But he remained unmoved. Day after day, week after week, the warnings of inevitable damnation, the proffered hopes of grace, fell on deaf ears. Then, all attempts proving useless, someone recalled that there might still be a chink in his armour which could let the light break through. His greatest delight had been in singing, not in drink, gambling, or cockfighting. He had by heart all the songs and ballads known throughout the countryside, and loved to sing them at every opportunity. So, a visiting preacher, prompted by this, suggested that if he couldn't pray, he might sing, and on the wings of Pentecostal melody find his baffled spirit on the path to glory. So, being an affable man, he consented, and when an acceptably devout hymn was proposed, he took it up for a bar or two, but the tune inevitably slithered back to one of the old secular songs he knew so well, that had waited on his lips so long. They tried again and again. The same thing happened, and in the end, they gave up, leaving him in a stubborn, unregenerated state. The year of grace passed. The urge for salvation receded, leaving only lingering traces in the changed lives of individuals here and there. The family grew up and left home to work in the new factories and mills of their rapidly expanding town, and he died at an advanced age. We are told that we carry within us the genes of our forebears which dictate what we are. And I find it in some times of rising popular opinion that I'm reluctant to surrender to it, avoiding as I do all mass movement in belief or allegiance, remaining rooted in the unyielding posture of my great-grandfather. And when I cast my vote, as I did the other day, for the unacceptable, unsuccessful candidate, it seemed likely that I did so at the unspoken bidding of that old man I never knew in the flesh.
Thank you very much indeed. It came as a wee bit of a surprise to me. I'm very interested in that particular occasion. Thanks very much for doing that for us. And again, it's John Hewitt talking about where he comes from and that kind of, what makes you who you are, even if you don't agree with it all, I'm suggesting that each of our panelists say a few words perhaps about their keenest memories or what they feel they want to say about Hewitt. And I'm pretty sure as we go on, this will open up into a wider discussion, which we can then open up to others in the audience. Shall we start with you, Brian, on I don't know, do you want to talk about the kind of more artistic aspect of Hewitt's life?
I'll talk more about John Hewitt as an artist, as an art historian. I titled this piece Hewitt and the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery. In 1946, addressing a Belfast audience on the subject of Irish art, John Hewitt commented, "You could put all of Irish painting into one portfolio and it would not amount to much." Hewitt was speaking at a time when little attention had been paid to the subject. Indeed, even 20-odd years later, in 1969, in their exhibition catalogue, Irish Portraits 1660 to 1860, a minor involvement of which marked my own introduction to the museum world, Anne Cruikshank and the Knight of Glyn hoped it would reveal a hitherto unknown and not inconsiderable facet of what is normally called, if mentioned at all, British art. Since that time, through numerous exhibitions, publications, seminars, specialist sales, auctions and so on, the subject of Irish art has received unprecedented attention, so that our knowledge of it and interest has been transformed. In the 19th century, pictures of the Irish peasantry in rustic gatherings and other stage settings had held sway. The first person to articulate the issue was a Lurgan-born man, George Russell, better known as A.E., who sought what he called a national art, which might awaken interest in the matter. Others, however, argued that Irish artists should ignore external influences and concern themselves solely with Irish themes, the precise nature of which remained unspecified. But A.E. and his supporters had their way. By the time of political independence in 1922, however, Irish painting, unlike Irish literature, had become centred on external aesthetic ideas and not specific Irish experience. And that strikes me that there should have been such a divergence between what artists wanted and what was happening in reality, because I think these words are true. For example, if you think of Jack Yeats and W.B. Yeats, they grew up in the same household. They sat around drinking coffee in the mornings or whatever, and they were open to the same ambience as other people. John Hewitt was active in the scene in the north and had set down his assessment of events in 3 articles which he published: Some Observations on the History of Irish Painting, Painting in Ulster, and Under 40, Some Ulster Artists. In these essays, we are introduced to the themes that most interested him. During his years in the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery, or the Ulster Museum as it now is. On the other hand, Hewitt was interested in painting in Ireland and in Ulster in particular, and on the other hand, his work, the work of his artist contemporaries in Belfast. Hewitt was not an art historian. His degree was in English, and his interest in seems to have been largely intuitive. His study of art is little recorded, seems to have been confined to a few classes attended at the Belfast College of Art in the late 1920s. Then in 1927, he accompanied his father on a trip to Belgium, visiting Brussels, Bruges and Ghent, where no doubt he browsed in the galleries and saw Hubert and Jan van Eyck's great Ghent altarpiece. and in 1929 and again in 1930 he visited Paris, where he would have encountered the latest trends in the avant-garde. But his interest in Ulster, in art in Ulster, was the work of William Connor, Theo Gracie, W.R. Gordon, J.H. Craig and Frank McKelvey, while Luke, Colin Middleton, John Turner, George Campbell, Gerard Dillon and Dan O'Neill were younger. Luke and Middleton, he thought, each, and I quote, by his own individual approach, achieved status of the front rank of painters in this island, and I believe beyond. Yet, as an art historian, Hewitt is less than convincing. Perhaps this is due to his excessive literary style. When Hewitt arrived at the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery in November 1930, he was just 23 years of age, had recently graduated from Queen's University, and was shortly returned to from his second visit to Paris. He had developed an awareness of the avant-garde and must, in the Belfast of those days, have appeared sophisticated in outlook to be cosmopolitan. His first and most notable exploit in the autumn of 1934, when he initiated the so-called Ulster unit. In June of that year, the painter Paul Nash, the English painter Paul Nash, and a few others who with the celebrated art critic Herbert Reed, had formed a group called Unit 1, the members of which were united by what Reed called a quality of mind, a truly contemporary spirit. Hewitt was interested in the outlook of this group, whose broadly left-wing political views were close to his own, and following their example, he hit upon the idea of forming a similar group in Belfast. Consequently, the Ulster unit was born in the autumn of 1934. The principal members of the unit included, not surprisingly, John Luke and Colin Middleton, and they held their first and only exhibition in the Loxley Hall at Belfast Carlton Restaurant in December 1934. In March 1942, Arthur Dean retired as curator of the museum and was succeeded by his deputy, Sidney Stendhal. Under Stendhal, the regime became a little more relaxed, and no doubt with the decades' experience in the job behind him, Hewitt was able to influence policies to a greater extent. That year, in 1942, Hewitt was appointed the museum's first ever Keeper of Art, with full responsibility for running the division.
Thank you, Brian. It's a whole other aspect of Hewitt's life from his poetry. One I think many of us don't know so much about. I think we'll come back to that again. But Vincent, in my selfishness, I never knew John Hewitt. I see him across the lecture room in Queen's. But you were involved in the very first summer school, which I didn't know about until just now. So I suppose I'm wondering about what do you think he would have thought of this? Do you know what I mean? What do you think his legacy is?
Well, I think the legacy is everybody here. I think at the time, my mother was very friendly with the McCanns, and because he'd left his body when he died, he left his body to medical science. There was no kind of funeral service or memorial, so there was a memorial held in the Lyric Theatre one Sunday night, and my mum wanted to go, so that's the only reason I was there. It was a complete luck. Jack McCann announced that there was going to be a summer school, and I didn't really know what a summer school even was then. And then I was at drama college and came home and was helping, like, picking up historians from there, for poets from there. I don't know what the collective noun for the type of people that go there. A murder, maybe. And we all we gathered in Garntar, and it was astonishing that this was happening in County Antrim, that you were having poets and intellectuals, were turning up here, and that voice, that dissenting voice that was huge in County Antrim, but it stopped in after the 1798 rebellion. That kind of idea of Catholic, Protestant, dissenter together, and that it felt there was a revival of it or something, that this voice could be heard again. Because if you remember at that time, there was a very, very loud voice coming out of County Antrim, and it was a very different Protestant voice, the Reverend Ian Paisley. And this seemed like it just an antidote to it, that there was some other, that so it was very inspiring, and it was very good for me personally to be reminded of that dissenting voice of John Hewitt. I think it's very, very important, and I think it was inspirational that this could happen in my own place. My father was a Glens man, so it was an amazing thing.
And of course, the summer school, some of us know, has changed and developed and broadened as we've gone out, as we've gone on. And I suppose what really strikes me most about Hewitt, personally, because I'm not a poet, is that it's not just as a poet, and that's not entirely what the summer school's about. Brilliant poetry, but it's the ideas behind it. That search for identity, which, the work you've been doing with Kibosh and so forth has been so much a part of. My first introduction was hearing One Saline Here, and as a prod, trying desperately to find out where I was supposed to fit in with all these people I didn't agree with at all. That poem really struck a huge chord with me, and I think that's why every year we can find, with no problem at all, a line from Hewitt that will give us there's enough meat on that to keep us going.
And it's nearly like you could pick a line and then the next year pick one that would contradict it.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful, it's nearly Brechtian in how that he go like that, and thinking out ideas through his writing. He does it very publicly, and for us, it's kind of like a real gift for us that he's done the thought, and it is contradictory. It's
but
complicated.
the main thing about that thought and the way it's expressed through the poems, which I think is so important for us, is we all feel safe here. And in using his words and his memories and his ideas to express things that you can't really say in an awful lot of places. So it's a safe space to debate things that, while they're public and controversial in many ways, are so close to us in terms of our identity and who we are and where we're going. I've been looking at some left-wing people, men and women in late 19th, early 20th century Belfast, and in the first half of the century, I keep coming across people who would have moved in the same circles as John Hewitt, and it keeps surprising me all the time. And Frank and I were talking earlier, and we were saying, so much has been written, but so much is actually not known. And I think maybe that's why, in some ways, he appears such a contradictory character, because we all kind of think we know bits, but maybe not enough. I wonder, Frank, would you like to, you're both personally and professionally, I think Hewitt meant a lot to you.
Well, I was going to deliver a 4-hour lecture about poetry, especially the development of some of the longer poems. But I decided against that and thought I would do something more anecdotal. If Hewitt were alive now and we phoned him up, he would say, "I'm not John Hewitt the actor, I'm not John Hewitt the rugby player, I'm not John Hewitt the old Estonian, I'm John Hewitt the poet." I got off on the wrong foot completely with John Hewitt on every level. When the British Army came into the north in the early 70s, Hewitt was on holiday in Hungary, and he produced in very quick time a pamphlet of poems, a booklet of poems called, God, I've forgotten the name, but I'm going to keep forgetting.
Tesserod.
No, that was a later book, in which he talked about the duties of the Ulster poet and
especially the Ulster Protestant poet and all the rest of it. And I reviewed this for the Honest Ulsterman, and reviewed it in a very acerbic kind of way. I didn't like it at all. And in fact, I still don't like it. I mean, I think that there are one or two good poems in there, poems that should be in a sort of selected Hewitt. But God, you know, there's that kind of element of self-importance somehow, you know, that some of the older poets, shouldn't be saying this, some of the older poets kind of adopted at the time. I remember a meeting in the Lyric Theatre with Mary O'Malley in the chair, and Hewitt was there, and John Montague was there, and God, Montague said something about travelling up from Dublin and passing through some rings of steel. And all I heard was the sound of fuck, which was my friend the poet Michael Foley reacting to it. Anyway, An Ulster Reckoning, the pamphlet was called An Ulster Reckoning, yeah. And I wrote my review, and in due course I got a letter from Hewitt, who still hadn't returned to the north from Coventry at that time. He was still working in Coventry. And it's a strange letter, you know. In one way it reflects genuine hurt, you know. I certainly felt very bad about this as soon as I read the letter. But there was also a very sharp kind of element in it, you know. He told me, for example, that if I really wanted to be an effective hatchet man, I should really read the works of William Hazlitt and various other people. You know, he produced a wee handbook on how to be a hatchet man. So I very quickly wrote an apologetic letter to him, and got a very kindly letter back. You know, he sort of seemed to understand that that was what young poets did from time to time. You know. After he came home to live in Stockman's Lane, I got to know him actually quite well. He could be very gruff, but he was like that all the time, you know. He was the same to everybody. He settled in Stockman's Lane, and we had moved into a new house in Eglantine Avenue on the Lisburn Road, and every bloody time I met Hewitt on the bus or walking on the Lisburn Road, he offered me a piece of delf, a sideboard on one occasion, and he seemed to have some sort of personal project to furnish my bloody house for Christmas. But it was all done in a very, very kindly way. You know, it was the hand of friendship being offered again and again, and he was quite funny about it as well. Now, as was said earlier on, he'd been a very isolated figure for most of his life. Hadn't had the kind of recognition that he should have had. But I think all that changed, or at least it changed considerably after he came back to live in Belfast. Jim Simmons has got a couple of lines somewhere where he says something like, God, I've forgotten him, I knew I'd do it. The daddy of us all, good old John Hewitt. The daddy of us all, yes. And he used to joke quite a lot about this himself. As the awards kept coming in, you know, he was joking about the fact that he could have used this award about 20 years ago. I actually had the pleasure of unveiling a memorial sort of plaque to John Hewitt in the Herbert Art Gallery in Coventry. And I was just asked to do this out of the blue, and I was very glad to do it. But it was interesting to talk to some of the writers and artists and so on who turned up on that occasion, you know, and the ones who were there certainly had a lot to say in favour of Hewitt. You know, they talked about the fact that his office was on the ground floor and the door was always sort of symbolically left open. They talked about the way in which he travelled, because although he left Belfast under a kind of cloud, and you talked, Brian, a bit about the you know, not getting the job in the Ulster Museum, which he felt he should have got. But one of the best things that ever happened to Hewitt was that move he made to Coventry, where he became, I suppose, a sort of an art gallery man's dream. He was there with an empty gallery and, you know, with the pleasure ahead of him of building up a completely new collection from scratch. And the thing is, this was happening in Coventry, and Coventry had something like, was twinned with at least 20 other cities and towns on the continent, at least 20. And Hewitt travelled an awful lot building up the art collection. He was also, of course, within reach of, you know, places like Stratford and London. When he looked back through the history of Coventry, he discovered that the Hewitt family had played quite an important part there, that there was a John Hewitt, for example, who had been a painter of scenes for Myrtle plays and all that. And he was very chuffed to kind of discover this, you know, that he had a sort of artistic line going back to the Middle Ages. And while he was living in Coventry, he continued to write a prose column for the Belfast Telegraph, in which occasionally there were articles which contrasted the freedom and the spirit and so on of Coventry with the kind of bigotry of the north of Ireland. I mean, the very fact that the Labour Party were strong, of course, in Coventry, the rebuilding of Coventry involved a tremendous influx of people of all colours and nationalities. And again, you know, Hewitt, I suppose, couldn't help contrasting all this with the place he had left behind, though he still never quite lost his contact with it. There was a period that he and his wife spent in the glens of Antrim. I don't know what else I want to talk about. I edited the collected poems of John Hewitt, and the whole experience is very vivid to me for personal reasons as well as others. My first marriage was in the throes of breaking up when I was editing the collected Hewitt, and in a way it was kind of therapeutic. You know, on a personal level it was therapeutic. I got into my car at Inst after school, drove up to the Coleraine where all the Hewitt stuff was, you know, in the collection there. Stayed and worked at the collected poems until the library closed. And there were actually months when I did that every single day. And it was it was strenuous, but it was a kind of pleasure. And also, of course, it taught me an awful lot about Hewitt, particularly the vast amount of unpublished material that was there in the university, and which is still there, so far as I know. Hewitt was the sort of poet who, when he went out for a walk, he came back home and he wrote 6 poems about it. But he was also a good self-critic, and you know, most of those poems didn't get beyond the notebook stage. Although later, when he returned to Belfast, you know, a lot of the books published with Blackstaff Press were reworkings of poems that had been written actually decades ago. There was something else there, which I've lost my thread.
Okay, we can come back to it again. But it'll be like that book title, You Remembered Suddenly.
Sorry, I seem to have oh no, sorry, yes, right. Thunderbirds are gold again. as Hewitt would say. Fuck me, I've lost it. It was, I remember I read through something like 48 handwritten notebooks of poems. And there were days I didn't ever want to see a poem again. But it was interesting all the same to see the way he worked. He obviously had a tremendous kind of belief in a kind of an apprenticeship to poetry, you know, so that, you know, for example, at one point he was writing poems in imitation of Gabriel Rossetti, you know, and he was trying out the Rossettian sort of sonnet. Now, it wasn't enough for Hewitt to write 10 or a dozen of these. There are 88 of them, you know, and all sorts of rhyme schemes and traditional structures and so on. You can see him testing them out. You know, the notebooks are full of that kind of stuff. And it is a bit wearing after a while, but at the same time you can see what he's doing, and you can see later in his published poems the effect of all that. I must say I sort of enjoyed Hewitt's company. He was interested in all sorts of things. He was in great form the year Coventry won the FA Cup. And, you know, nearly every week Hewitt would turn out for readings at the English Society at Queen's. You know, he hardly ever didn't attend. And he was usually accompanied by a neighbour of his called John Kilfeather. And, you know, it looked like Hewitt and his minder talking into the room. It was quite funny. And through the Arts Council as well, he sort of supported new writers. I had reason to be grateful to him in a number of ways, and to get his help in a number of ways. There was one occasion where there was an editorial written by me in the Honest Ulsterman, which was a sort of an attack, or which poked fun at a poet called Pádraig Fake, who had just produced an anthology of troubles poetry called The Wearing of the Black. And the editorial takes the piss mercilessly out of Pádraig Fake, and he was very upset about it. About a week later, a week after the magazine appeared, Hewitt phoned me and said it would be a good idea to give Fake the chance to reply. Why not offer an editorial to Fake? Which is what I did. And Fake's editorial is very funny, and it talks about one of the younger poets who looks down his nose at you like a bishop. All Muldoon. It's full of that kind of stuff, you know, really knockabout banter. And also when I edited the Poets from the North of Ireland anthology, I consulted Hewitt about the introduction, and the only change he made was he objected to my use of the word poetesses. And he said, "You'll get in trouble, you'll get in trouble." So I can't remember what it changed to, but the poetesses at the back door. The book was launched, that green where all the wine was going out, at the bottom of University Road, you know, Lower Crescent. There was a teacher centre in there. And that was where the book was launched. There were a group of poets, including Montague was there, Longley, Hewitt, and various others, in a sort of a ring around a slightly raised kind of thing, and the audience was out there. And about halfway through the reading, I'm suddenly aware that Hewitt is leaning slightly backwards like this, and the chair is just creeping towards the edge of the thing, you know. Had to leap forward, sort of grab Hewitt, you'd want him and bring him to the front. Although it's not relevant to the other thing to say is that the funniest thing that night was Pádraig Field doing his reading. You know, people hadn't heard that sort of odd semi-American accent and all the rest of it, and were completely fascinated by him, you know. And he was reading these poems about British soldiers lying in ditches, aiming guns, and you know, he was a lonely little winter robin. A description of a British soldier who's got on his side. And it was absolutely wonderful stuff. Right, I'm going to stop on that.
Oh, thank you.
Except no gallery relating to Hewitt should pass by without somebody telling the story of the official opening of the John Hewitt pub. The main speaker was Michael Longley, and John was quite an abstemious sort of individual, he didn't drink very much, and Longley said in his introductory remarks, naming a pub after John Hewitt is like naming a brothel after Mother Teresa.
That's good. And we get more of a sense actually about the man John Hewitt. But I've heard such different things about. I'm wondering, Adrian, how you found him. You know, when you were
That
working with
afternoon?
him. Yeah.
Well, he was very congenial company, but you knew that, you know, at any moment he could take issue, and he could. Funny enough, the word in my mind is that he was sort of congenially contrary. You know, there wasn't sort of, not an adversarial streak in him, but he was a contrarian. And David Hammond gave me a wonderful image of this, because David made a film portrait of him, and it opened at the Outlands Fair in Ballycastle on August 15th, and the establishing shot was the people coming out of Mass on the feast of the Immaculate Conception, whatever the 15th of August is, I can't remember. So they're all coming out, this huge flow of people going down the street, and there's one man coming towards the camera, making his way through this crowd, going against the flow, and it's John Hewitt. The other thing I remember about him, I had great admiration for, he was very good at smoking the pipe. He was a very tidy pipe smoker. And it's an art which I used to practice myself, but of course you have to stop all these things. But I still have a hankering for it, and I admire the way he lit the pipe. He was good at that.
Did you edit him? Did you edit the script, or did you do the script as he said?
I know as much as he did it, but I wouldn't have had as much neck as Paul Muldoon, who told the story here one time about editing a sonnet. John Hewitt recorded the sonnet for him, and Muldoon thought it was too long, and he dropped the last line. And lived to tell the tale.
Can I just ask you, Brian, just because I'm really interested in this, and I'm going to round off in a wee minute, but as a curator and so forth, and it seems he did very well in Coventry, and I think you're right, it did him a favour and all that kind of stuff. Was he regarded as successful in that aspect of his life by the end of it, after Coventry?
I think he was succeeded or regarded as successful. Maybe success isn't the right word, because he knew particularly John Luke extremely well, and he knew Colin Middleton almost equally well. But I remember one day I was, as a young curator, hanging pictures in the Irish Gallery of all places, and I hung these on the line, as we used to say, and John Hewitt came in and talked for a minute or two, and he said, well, I wouldn't have done it like that. And he said it in that tone of voice. And yet, I have to say, later on, I was writing a book called Irish Art and Modernism. And Hewitt, I was talking to Hewitt at his house, and Hewitt said, well, his papers were still there, they hadn't gone to the University of Ulster. And Hewitt said, well, if my papers can be of any use to you, you're free to use them, which I did. And anyway, I thought that was very generous of him to do that. But as an art historian, he strikes me as less than successful, as I said, less than convincing, because he had a very floral style which he applied to his writing and whatever it was in any phase. So,
Brian, could I just ask you, did he have some significant role in bringing attention to John Luke? Would that be a fair thing to say?
yeah, the Ulster Museum has 5 or 6 looks and so on. And one of these he commissioned called the Rehearsal. And he commissioned the rehearsal, and he also commissioned at the time about two studies of how Luke started off in grisaille, which is black, basically black and white, and then flooded colour on over that, very much as the ancients painters had done. I think those were very successful paintings. He was a champion of Luke, of course, in particular, and a true champion, as it were.
I think maybe we should open it up.
Just I remember, Brian, I might be wrong, maybe I've invented this. In a previous talk, did you mention that John Hewitt got into trouble in the Ulster Museum by inviting groups of school children to tour around, including nude sculptures? Sure, I didn't make that up.
I might have done so, but I don't remember that.
It should be true.
Anyone else like that?
Can I ask the panel if they have any experience or memories of John's wife, Roberta? Because if you read the recent biography by Bill McCormack, yes, sorry, Bill McCormack, it's almost as much a biography of her as it is of him.
But Frank, we were talking about this earlier.
Yeah, this is a terrible story, but Hewitt could be very monosyllabic, and sometime after his wife died, somebody met him walking along the Lisburn Road, said, how are you, John? Fine. How's the poetry going, John? Fine. How's Ruby, John? Dead.
What we were saying earlier was I think she's a particularly interesting woman, and the work that she did in terms of nursery schools and many other things. And I think what we were saying is that there's still an awful lot of things that we perhaps don't know as much as we'd like to, and room for more research and so forth on her. I think just living with John Hewitt, there must have been many interesting stories in any case.
Well, he
Anyone
does
else?
write interestingly about her. I mean, there were a number of sonnets, for example, called Sonnets for Roberta, which are lovely poems, but full of guilt and all the rest of it. Now, he kept those for decades, and he didn't publish them until after her death. And you know, you could put together a little collection of about maybe 10 or a dozen quite moving love poems.
Yeah, if I could say, I was giving a talk on Hewitt to some Australians last month, and I read a couple of the sonnets to Roberta, and they were moved to tears, some of them, you know, at the emotion in the sonnets.
There's a lovely one about in the garden or something. Yeah, that sticks in my mind.
Passion for gardening.
Yes.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Yeah.
This should be a song.
Yeah.
Well, it's just interesting that he obviously couldn't bring himself to embrace the kind of confessional mode in poetry, you know, and he kept the poems until, presumably until they couldn't do any more hurt. Yes. Yeah.
This is a very mundane subject to get back to, but I just heard Adrian mention there that he was a very tidy pipe smoker, and I seem to remember that the image of John Hewitt, as we first saw it, did contain a pipe in his jaw, and I wonder, has that image been sanitized by the political by by the PC brigade? Is there anyone who can comment on that? Because
I think Tony probably can comment on that. I know we've looked at the image and we've wondered sometimes, you know, as we've moved on and used his thoughts and ideas so much, and to try to talk to a younger generation, and we've thought, is this image of an old man the right one? But I'm not sure about the pipe aspect.
The pipe still appears in a bust of Hewitt, which I think is in the pub, so it hasn't died out completely.
Besides, he's moved on to cocaine by
Thank you.
Question for you, Frank. You mentioned the collected poems, and I'm fairly new to John Hewitt's work. I got your selected poems by David Hammond, but when I'm looking for prose works, things like that, it's all out of print. Would you know if there's plans to bring more of his work back into print, including diaries, letters, things like that?
No, there has been a steady. There have been 3 or 4 books about Hewitt recently, now over the last 2 years or so. W.J. McCormick, I think, was one. I can't remember who wrote the other one. I know
There's Northland, which is Hewitt's.
Yes, yes. The selected prose was called Ancestral Voices, isn't that right? Which was edited by Tom Klein. But whether there's any plan to reprint that, I don't know. I don't think there's any plan to reprint the collected poems, which was, I mean, the way I edited it, I would say it was a bit of a tombstone, you know. And the selected poems that Michael Longley and I did is a much better introduction, much better representation of Hewitt.
Wasn't there also the publication about 5 years ago, the Northlight collection of
That's
prose?
right, yeah, that's right.
It's a nice thing.
And I know of people behind the scenes who are working on, you know, Hewitt's correspondence with various people. You know, there's some research going on there. So.
Frank Ferguson, is he doing some stuff? Anyway, I think there are things that one ought to be able to get from somewhere, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's more to come in the future. Any more questions out there?
I wrote a book some years ago on T.P. Flanagan, and Hewitt was a close friend of T.P. and I've read some of his correspondence with T.P. And so on, and I think it's fair to say he looked upon T.P. as a sort of father. Yes, Hewitt looked upon T.P. as a sort of father figure, TP's mother had gone to Dublin in when he was about 3-year-old, and after that, I think TP looked upon Hewitt as a sort of father figure, and Hewitt often guided him in exhibition preparation and that sort of thing, and was generally looked up to by him. But I was interested in what Vincent said earlier, this is by the by, talking about the great revival of, was it 1859? And Paul Henry, whom I've also written about, Paul Henry's father, Robert Mitchell Henry, who took his 3 or 4 sons out and made them walk in order of seniority, as it were, along the towpath of the Lagan and so on. But Robert, this is the point Liam reminded me of Robert Mitchell's congregation. He was a clergyman of the Reformed Presbyterian Church, and his congregation, which was in just at the beginning of May Street, had the usual trickle of people on a Sunday. But after the Reformation, I don't know what the figures were, but you know, it was something like 500 or 1,000 people joined his congregation, and so on.
Well, Brian, I've been trying not to say a word. I've worked on the 1859 revival, so I've been trying not to say anything about that. That's a version that comes very much from Ian Paisley's thesis and writing on it. Wasn't quite as dramatic as it was painted, and was a result of many other influences and things, and certainly didn't last, except amongst the Baptist community and so forth, but I'm not going to go into all of that now. Is there a question over here?
I was interested in his role in the Northern Ireland Labour Party, because to my knowledge, one of the reasons why he wasn't made head of the Ulster Museum, or a man called Seavey was instead, was because of his socialism and friendship with Mary O'Malley and so on. But did he play a big role in the Northern Ireland Labour Party? Because why would the unemployed centre set up a pub in his name if he didn't?
I keep coming across him in the research that I'm doing on that sort of on the left in that period. But it's very difficult. I certainly don't know enough about him to know his whole engagement, but there was this whole wide circle of left wing is the only way I can describe them, because a lot of them didn't fall into those very neat categories that we think of, though they were accused of doing so.
Towards the end of his life, he supported the Workers' Party.
Yeah.
Could I add on this? Tomorrow we'll be looking at the story behind the production of Over the Bridge, and among the people on the panel then will be Brian Garrett, who was prominent in the Northern Ireland Labour Party in the 50s and 60s, and maybe a bit better answer on that.
But again, it's a period when my interest came out finding out all these women who were involved. So I've been looking at the cooperative movement and the early socialist and communist parties and the links there. And an amazing bunch of interesting people. And I keep here and there coming across Hewitt's name. So there's work to be done.
He was engaged during the war to give talks on Marxism to soldiers in training in Northern Ireland. He said it was one of the reasons why he got such a sense of the countryside. He travelled to all these camps in Armagh, Antrim and Down, because the ally was the Soviet Union, and the establishment, the state, wanted the soldiers to understand something of that ideology. and he was the man.
All these
Interesting.
things that got brushed under the carpet again, it's so true in so many aspects of our history. So there's going to continue to be new things coming to the surface.
Well, they didn't really look at all at regionalism.
No,
No.
of course. And the time was when that was the first thing you looked at when you thought of Hewitt. And I remember some early summer schools where regionalism was really, you know, up at the top there. So that's interesting in itself and says more about us, perhaps.
Hi. I've got another question for Frank. In his timing commentary, did Hewitt kind of seek out other Irish groups? Because I know around that time there were Irish groups in the city, from Coventry myself, both wanting, some wanting unification of Ireland, some wanting peace in Ireland. Sometimes they wanted both things, but a bit more controversial. But then in Poem Irishman commentary, he seems to cut more kind of aloof figure, a bit more distant. So just wondering, did he participate in Irish politics within the city? There's a lot in that question.
I know very little about this, to be honest. And I don't know them really well. I don't know of any examples of you mean with the Irish language?
No. More like, Irish community, like the Irish kind of civics, Irish people involved with maybe the Labour Party, trade unions within Coventry at that time?
I don't know how much in later life. Certainly that was a very important kind of, when he started out as a poet, he was writing sort of propaganda verses for communist newspapers, working class, all kinds of material like that, which I included as an appendix in the collected poems, because as poems these things are actually very poor, they're just doggerel, you know, but at the same time they represent an important kind of strand and one that developed considerably. But how long that went on, I don't know.
Okay, thank you, everybody. If anyone on the panel has a last desperate word that they regret not having been able to say, I don't want you shouting at me.
Yes, I'll shout at everybody else. No, there's a line from Hewitt that's been in my head from the point where I first heard it. And I first heard it from Paul Muldoon, who had been doing a programme at the BBC on which Hewitt had written a prose piece. At some point during their conversation, Hewitt said to Paul Muldoon, "You know what my problem was? I didn't have any imagination."
That's something for us to think about.
Sure he is.
Thank you.
That's the lady cut from the sun.
I'd really like to thank you all very much, and I hope you've appreciated, as I certainly have, finding out, getting a more rounded picture of the man whose work has brought us where we are today, and for taking time out of, I know, what are very busy schedules. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.